Good morning. You were sleeping. I saw you all jump when I said good morning. Well, we're in Esther, and we're glad that you've chosen to join us this morning to look at this next little place that we go in this amazing, amazing story. The title of the sermon this morning is A Greater Honor. Excuse me. It begins in Esther 9. Actually, we're going to pick up in verse 8 in just a minute and goes all the way through the 14th chapter, or the 6th chapter in verse 14. I went to, at times, getting to preach to thousands, to now barely being heard except by one cranky old man, and the only reason he wanted to hear me is because he wanted me to get on with what I was saying so I could get on to what he wanted me to do. I was at one point sought out for wisdom, and now the only reason anybody sought me out was because I had a strong back and I could stand the smells that came from body odors. I once was considered to be a person that was a real advantage in people's life. I could be a real helper for them. And I went from that to being a person that for the most part was taken advantage of. I thought that I'd come to the end of my life, and now the rest of my life, in my incredible wisdom, was going to be a living hell. But you know, something happened. I realized an amazing thing. The God of this universe was calling me to a greater honor, and I didn't even know it was happening. I was complaining the whole time. I spent many nights either yelling at God or complaining to Him. And I spent this great amount of time saying, God, what in the world are you doing? But here's what I discovered. In the life of a believer, a follower of Christ, there's this thing that He calls us into. And this thing is a greater honor than anything we've ever done in our life before. Now, I want you to hear me, that I want you to dream big dreams. I want you to be at this place in life where you have dreams about the great things you'd like to accomplish for the kingdom of God, for your family, for your kids, what you'd like for your kids to turn out. All those things are great things. But there is a greater place of honor. There is a greater honor, and the honor is this: to be called into the service of a living God of this universe so that you could do something for Him, so that you could be a conduit for Him in this world. Now, this story of Esther is about some people, more specifically Mordecai and Esther, who came to understand what a greater honor it was to be God's man and God's woman at a particular place in time, as Randy talked about like last week, for such a time as this. This morning, as we think together about a greater honor, I don't want you to think about big things that will be accomplished, even though there may be many big things to be accomplished. I don't want you to think about a life that somehow distinguishes itself so radically that people are talking about you decades from now, although that may very well happen for some of you. But I'm talking about the kinds of things that happens when God, in all that He is doing and working in the details of life, like Randy went into great detail about last week, when He's working behind the scenes, suddenly brings you to this point in life where you have a greater honor. Except the problem is, a lot of times when we arrive at those places, it doesn't feel like a greater honor. As a matter of fact, it feels very confusing and difficult. And it's hard to even see it as a place of honor at all. So let's go to the passage today. Come with me as we discover what it is to be able to operate in a greater place of honor, to have the greater honor. We're going to actually pick up in verse 8 here together. Chapter 5 and verse 8. But as we begin the story, remember this. Esther's now the queen of the king of Persia. She has a very important place, but at this particular point, she had not been called into the king's presence. And as Randy talked about last week, you don't just walk into the king's presence. As a matter of fact, it was punishable by death unless he held out the mercy scepter, and indeed he did that for her. The reason she was going in to see him, if you don't recall, or if you weren't able to be here last week, is because she found out from Mordecai that because of his willingness to stand up and not bow down to Haman, that he was actually, he had decided not only was he going to punish Haman, but he was going to wipe out all the Jews. And Mordecai came to Esther and said, hey, look, you've got to do something about this. You're the queen. And she says, whoa, no, don't get me involved. But then she finally sees the urgency of the thing. And she says, yes, I'll do something. And so we pick it up on the heels now that she's gone into the king's presence. She's there. He held out the mercy serpent. Not serpent. Woo! He said, you can come on in. There's some things that just don't come out. If they're not going to come out, so you just have to keep going. So she's there, and he says this: you get to have anything you want up to half of my entire kingdom. Now, everybody understands that basically he was giving her a blank check. You can have what you want. And that's where we pick up the story. And now when he says that, here's her answer. Chapter 5, verse 8. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet. I will prepare for them, and then I will answer the king's question. As we think about a greater honor, I want you to first think in this context that there is an influence that comes with this greater honor, an influence that comes with this greater honor, and we begin to see it unfold in the life of Esther, right here. Remember, Esther was about to be the person who would save this Jewish nation. And she was trying to figure out a way to be a part of that and use her place of influence in this kingdom that she was now the queen of. Now, I don't want to soft sell this or make it look all pretty. You understand, these people were here, the Jews were here, and they were under this culture that was definitely anti-God because they could have had an opportunity to leave but had not. And so there's all kinds of inferences that we might make about these guys were kind of in disobedience to begin with, but the truth is they were in a culture that was completely pagan, and they were under a king that was one of the most infamous kings of that time. He was completely self-consumed and self-centered and wanted everybody to bow the knee to him. And so she was the queen of this fellow. But what I simply want you to see first about this influence of great honor is Esther looked at herself, being a Jew, and being in a culture that did not agree with her way of thinking or her value systems, and said, I am still in this culture. And I have the ability, I have the honor of somehow stepping in the gap of doing something to save a whole group of people from extinction. And it was her own people. And I would suggest to you that we also have an influence, a greater place of honor. And my challenge to you first this morning is to say this: I plead with you to recognize that you have a place of influence. You have a place of influence. You say, well, of course I do, Tim. I'm breathing. But it's a particular kind of influence, and I want to talk to you a little bit about it. Esther, when she spoke, when she came out to begin to use her place of influence as the queen, do you know she could have just talked about Haman all at that time? Because the king said, I'll give you half of everything I have. So you got to know, for whatever reason, because she was beautiful, because she was his wife, the truth is she had the king's ear, and she could have laid it all out right there, but she did not. She continued to invest time, energy, effort, and she didn't play all her cards at once. Because what you'll see, she actually played 2 banquets, and every time as they came along, she was saying, now, king, if you'll come and bring Haman to this banquet, then this is what I'm going to do. Then I'll tell you what my request is. Now, we could read on in the story, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I just want you to recognize that not only did she use her point of influence, but she used it, and she was patient to invest in the culture that she was involved in at that particular time. Now, honestly, as I was read this story, and I was thinking about Esther, I feel very much like her. there are a lot of people and a lot of situations that I find myself in, that I have a place of influence in, that do not necessarily buy a same value system that I have. There are things that I value definitely that they don't value, and there's a way of doing life that that they definitely don't value. And I'm not suggesting that I'm perfect and everybody else has lost it. I'm just saying I recognize there's this diverging difference. There's this huge difference between myself and the culture in which I live. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I dare say that there are some of you that as you've interacted in our world today, whether it's with believers or unbelievers, people who haven't yet followed Christ, I would dare say that you have seen people do things in the culture, in this area of influence that you've been involved with, that just disgust you. It may be that some days you've seen people and you thought you wanted to lay hands on them, and it wasn't for a blessing, like that. And you're just saying, man, somebody's got to do something about that. And so there's this thing in you that says, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. As a matter of fact, more and more I hear people say this, man, I just want to get out of here. My mama lived till she was 85. About 3 years ago, she died. And this is what she said to me about 3 weeks before she died. I'm done. I am not putting up with this anymore. I'm out of here. Just thought I'd say goodbye to you before I left. And 3 weeks later, she died with nothing wrong with her. So I'm telling you, my mama just decided she was going, and Jesus said, okay. And I kind of know what that feels like sometime. But if you're here with us, I want you to hang on. If you haven't yet chosen to be a Christ follower, the rest of the sermon is not about beating you up because you haven't become a Christ follower. Right now, I'm primarily talking to believers. I'm just saying that there are times when we live in a culture like Esther's that seems to be consuming everything I am and the whole way I do life. It gets pretty frustrating, right? It does. And everything in me some days just wants to retreat. Pictures of me walking on the beach with Karen are looking better and better to me right now, and none of y'all are included. Love you, but you're not there. I mean, I'm just, and neither is anybody else, because some days I'm just feeling like I'm done with all this. But here's what I recognize, and so did Esther. My withdrawing from that community, the community of influence that I have, that place that God has deposited me, and with whomever I might be interacting, they may repulse me, they may disgust me, I may not like the way they do things, and oh, by the way, some of the things I won't like in them because it's really what I see in them, what I see in me, but that's beside the point. I just don't want to be around that anymore, and so the tendency is to pull away, but I challenge you to see and recognize your place of influence like Esther. And what that's going to require, it is an investing in the culture that's around you rather than a withdrawing. And being at a place where you are interacting sometimes in things and with people that they may not be your first choice on the list of people to hang out with. But you recognize that you have a place of influence, and for what? I want you to listen carefully to this. The greater place of honor is that you get to be God's man or God's woman in a place, in a community, and with people who either they are themselves being destroyed by their own choices in life, or they're destroying others, both in this life and for the life to come. Esther saw a greater place of honor. And this greater place of honor was to invest herself in this culture that she surrounded so she could save the people of God. That was her place of ministry at that particular time. I'm suggesting to you that we should intentionally, even when we're having all these weird feelings, recognize that we are God's man and God's woman in these places and cultures so that we engage people in such a way, and it's going to take a lot of time. And it's going to take a lot of energy. There's a young adult person that I'm involved with and have been for the last 15 years. And it has broken my heart to see him do life. Because as I've seen him do life over these last 15 years, he has made some really, really, really poor choices in life. His teeth are nearly rotted out from his cocaine use, even though he's not doing it now. His liver is destroyed. He is completely emotionally spent because he's a compassionate guy that doesn't know when to say no and what boundaries are in relationships. And I have cried for him, and I have prayed for him, and I'm telling you, he's about as much anti-church and anti-God as you can be, except for about the last year. And in this last year, he's begun to have a whole nother conversation. And this was the first one. Maybe, just maybe, the way I'm choosing to do life is not working. Well, here's what I want you to see. He's made me so mad I couldn't spit straight. I mean, all the stupidity that he's done along the way. It's been very difficult to watch that. And frankly, there's been several times when he's taken advantage of me. Now, I'm not asking you to say, oh, wow, Tim allowed himself to be taken advantage of. No, I'm a big weenie, and I have a hard time saying no. But see, this is what I want you to see. God's got you as his man or his woman in his place, in the place of influence, and he even knows your weaknesses and how he can use that to bring that person that's in this place of destruction to this aha moment when they say, maybe I'm just not doing life exactly the way it ought to be. Are you following what I'm saying? But if you don't show up and you allow this pull that says, I'm going to pull myself away from this world that I live in and not recognize my place of influence, it's going to be very difficult for you to have one. Yet next, there's a cost of greater honor. Beginning in verse 5, Haman went out that day happy and high spirits. The reason he did is because now he's going to go to a banquet. Excuse me. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage again against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and he went home. Now, for the sake of time, he said he went in and talked to his friends, and he boasted about that he was going to be the only one at the dinner, and he was a really important guy, and everybody was going to know that. And then in verse 13, we pick up on it. So this guy's now the second in charge. And the king's wife, the queen, has now said, I just want the king and Haman here with me. Of course, she's setting up an opportunity to expose him to save the Jews. But he says this, so he's at the top of the heap. His family's all telling him how wonderful he is. And this is a guy who couldn't be satisfied with just punishing Haman for not bowing to him. No. He's got to destroy a whole group of people because he's ticked off that he didn't get acknowledged. But he says, but it gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. His wife and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits, about 75 feet, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Someone would say it was a gallows. And then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. And listen to this, it says, and the suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So here's a guy that's got everything, and it's not enough. He says, I've got one little fly in the ointment. It's that one guy that won't bow the knee to me. It's the one guy that won't agree with me. I got news for you. There's a lot of people in our world that are not going to agree with you. And everything in their life is going okay. And then somewhere along the way, either you say or they see you acting in a way that is counter to their value system. And guess what? The mere sight of you is going to make them sick. So my next challenge is for you to realize that you have a position in this world if you want to participate in this greater honor. And the position is not a fun one. I want to be very clear about it. Excuse me. I had a conversation just this Saturday morning in a restaurant not to be named. And a fellow was we were kind of watching a game, and a fellow said, I was working on my Surface Pro. He says, what are you doing? I said, I'm putting together some teachings. And he said, what do you do? And I said, well, this thing, I'm kind of talking about how trust gets built in people. And he says, what, are you a philosopher? I thought, wow, he doesn't know me that well. He says, are you a philosopher? And he says, I know. He says, maybe you're a psychologist. I like to guess what people do. And I said, well, I maybe a Southern philosopher, and maybe I know a little bit about psychology. And I'm just kind of goading him along because I'm wondering where this conversation's going to go. And finally he says, so why do you do this? Why do people even ask you for stuff like this? And I said, well, I do some teaching and put together some things for people. And he said, well, what's the scope of it? And well, I thought, okay, here's my chance. I said, well, there's a little psychology in it, maybe a little philosophy, and there's stuff about spiritual matters too. Well, you thought would have just thrown up on him at that point. He gets madder and horny. He says, what do you mean spiritual stuff? And I said, well, I actually believe that Christ had a couple of really incredible things to say. And so that's a part of what I do when I communicate to people. He says, you're a really smart guy. I've heard you talking about a lot of things in here. But you had to go and mess it up. You're smarter than this. I thought, well, you actually are probably right about that, but that's kind of beside the point. But as the conversation went on, this guy basically got angry at me, folded up his book that he was reading, paid for his stuff, and went storming out. And I thought I was pretty nice. Well, what I recognize is that I have a position in this world, and the mere sight of Jesus is repulsing to some people. He is. Jesus said they hated me, so they're going to hate you. Now, why am I even bringing this up? Is it so you can say, wow, I need to take my Surface Pro and start conversations? No, that's just me. That's the way I do things. That's why sometimes I wish I could be left alone. But that's the way things happen for me. That's not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is that many of you could get genuinely excited about having the greater honor. To be God's man or God's woman in a world and recognize that there's a place that you might get to be a part of pulling them out of the destruction that they're experiencing in this life and potentially in the life to come. And you go, I want to be that. I want to go there. Except then you head out of here and you determine to do that, and you're just loving people. You're caring about people. You're investing in their life. And all of a sudden, some guy comes along and says, you're just stupid. Why'd you have to go talking about Jesus? And you're so distraught, or at least it wipes you out, and you think, look, I was just trying to honor God with what I'm doing, and I want to be very clear that if you're choosing to go to this place of greater honor, there is going to be a lot of people that don't care what you're talking about. This world does not honor you. If you want the greater honor, this world does not honor you. This world thinks lots of things about you, that you're shameful, that you're a hate speech person, that you're narrow-minded, and the truth is, some of us are. I'm telling you, this world does not honor you because of your position, but if you want the greater honor, you will have to decide in your mind that if I choose to be involved in the greater honor of being God's man or God's woman in people's lives, this is coming. There's an action of greater honor as well. Turn back to the scriptures in Esther chapter 6 and verse 1. He says, that night the king couldn't sleep, so he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. And it was recorded there, that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. And then I'm going to take you back to chapter 3 where this other thing happened. And chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. After these events, the king honored Haman, and it says, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of any of the other nobles. And all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. And then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. And if you'd read on in the passage, you find out he says, it's because I'm a Jew. It was because of his faith. It was because of what was going on, this value system that he had. Now, there are plenty of people way smarter than I am that study the book of Esther and would picture the Jews that were in the kingdom at this time in complete disobedience, and that none of them had any heart for God at all. They would even suggest passages that say, and I think Randy might have even referenced this, where it talks about that they fasted, but it doesn't say they prayed and fasted. And I don't know where you're at with all that, but I'm going to tell you that I think there was something about Mordecai. I believe in my heart. This guy Mordecai had some sense. He may have been in disobedience. He may have not been in a great place with God. We don't have that kind of description, but I think we see a man who had conviction and a man that was willing to stand for this value system that he had. Now, I want you to stick with me here, because what I'm about to say next is descriptive about this issue of the action of this greater honor. I would like for you to resolve to act boldly. But I want to define very specifically what boldly is, because in our culture today, there's a real problem. We've defined resolving to act boldly as something very different, in my opinion, of what is actually exposed here in the Scripture. If you look up at the bottom at the diagram, you'll see a thing there that says, stand up and speak up. Well, there's actually several movements that have grabbed hold of this phrase, and they all do a little different graphic with it. Just go on the internet and put in stand up, speak up, and you'll see it. One of them is bigotry. You know, and specifically the racial tension between the white community and the black community. Hey, I get that. I have 2 kids that are married. 2 of my 6 kids are married. One lives up in Michigan. The other one lives in Texas right now. And Amy is married to Quentin. Quentin, I'm very jealous of because he has a permanent tan. And I told him that I'm going to have to be asking for forgiveness because he has a permanent tan. Now, if you haven't noticed, I'm white. Just filling you in. And my daughter is the whitest white woman you ever met in your life. And Quentin is the blackest black man you ever met in your life. And Quentin and I talk all the time about lots of things, but one of the things we were talking about not too terribly long ago, I said, Quentin, what's it like with that whole black-white thing and people being married, and, you know, or is there still bigotry in America? And, of course, he just laughs. And he says, well, it depends on where you go. He says, I went to Louisiana thinking all things would be good, and he says, Amy and I could barely go out to eat in Louisiana because we caught so much grief. Well, you know what that makes me want to do? I mean, Quentin is the finest man I've ever met, bar none. And I just want to get a hold of people and beat them with a bat when I hear about that. I do want to stand up and do something about that because it makes me mad. So I get it why people want people to stand up and speak up. It's also connected, to adult bullying and child bullying and internet bullying. It's also connected to hate speech and all those other kinds of things like that. But I'd like to give it a very specific definition. If everybody else can use the graphic, so can I. I'd like to give it a very specific kind of description, beginning with Mordecai. When you look at Mordecai, there are 2 ways that he actually responded boldly. The first one was to stand up, and the second one was to speak up. I would talk to you first about the thing that he did to stand up. Long before he wouldn't bow the knee, long before he had the conversations with the guys that tried to get him to bow the knee to Mordecai, he actually stood up in a very particular way. In the very particular way that he stood up, he was involved in a circle of influence, a culture that was completely anti-God. It was pagan God. But he was a judge in that system. So he didn't have a choice about whether or not he was living in this culture. He found himself living in the culture, and he happened to be walking in the court one day, and there were these 2 guys that were supposed to guard the door to the king's palace so that he would remain safe. And he heard the 2 of them conspiring to kill the king. You know what Mordecai did? He told on them. He went and reported it, and these guys got taken care of, and the king didn't get killed. Now, you might imagine that he might be thinking, well, you know, that guy's a pagan anyway. You know, that guy's really evil. He's completely self-centered. Why am I going to say, it'd be a good thing if the guy get knocked off. I want to tell you, it wouldn't be the first time I've heard something like that talking about the people who are in charge of various branches of our government, and sitting in restaurants and hearing believers talk about, well, you know, maybe somebody just get crazy and kill them. Mordecai did not operate that way. He recognized that even if some of it was by his own choosing, he recognized he was in this culture and in this place of influence, and he decided to operate as a man of integrity within the culture and the place that he found himself. And so the first way that he spoke up, the first way that he stood up was very simply to be God's man and do things in an honorable way and with integrity within the culture in which he lived. He exposed these killers. He took care of them. But then the second way that he responded boldly is he actually finally spoke up. And how did he do that? Well, after he had the opportunity to invest himself slowly over a period of time and show himself to be credible in this culture in which he lived, he then, when it came time for him to make a personal statement for himself, when he was challenged, he said, no, I disagree with that. Remember, I'm not telling you that if you say I disagree with you or I'm not in line with you about that or I think what you're doing is wrong. I'm not saying everybody's going to love that, but I'm telling you Mordecai did the first thing first, which was to be the man that he was to be in this culture. Excuse me. The problem that we have today is the church is known for something much more than these two things. I want you to think of these two bands that I had up on the diagram earlier. It was a white band and a black band. I want you to think about this, that together they are representative of this idea that I need to respond boldly in very particular and specific ways. Excuse me. And one without the other is worthless. Let me read you what people outside the church, comes from John Pavlich, who wrote a book about why people are leaving the church, and he says this, and you may not agree with everything he says, but listen. He says, we know you like to fight, church. That's obvious. When you want to, you can go to war with the best of them. The problem is your battles are too small. Fast food protest, hobby store outrage, duck-calling reality TV shows, campaigns may manufacture some urgency and Twitter activity on the inside for the already convinced, but they're paper tigers to people out there with bloody boots on the ground. Every day we see a world suffocated by poverty and racism and violence and bigotry and hunger, and in the face of that stuff, you get awful, quite frighteningly quiet. We wish you were courageous in those fights, because then we'd feel like coming along beside you, and then we'd feel like going to war with you. Now, Chris loves to use the word snarky, and I agree this guy has a snarky attitude, okay? But he says it outright. And I'm not, whether or not you like all that he said or not, is it true that there's a world out there that perceives us to be this way? Yes or no? It is true. So what I'm asking you to do is to resolve to act boldly, because here's what I'm afraid. I'm afraid that sometimes we have spoken up without standing up to be involved in the culture, and for them to understand that we want to work with them and be beside them in the middle of all your messiness and all the stuff that we don't agree with, but we will invest life with you in this very particular way. Here's the challenge: to get involved in the place of influence involved in this culture, to actually speak whatever language they have, and that they would understand that we are a people of compassion. And at the same time, after years of investing in that, having the privilege to speak into their lives. I want to have a little disclaimer here. Then no, I'm not even going to do that. Let's just move on. It's just something that I'm peeved about, and it isn't really pertinent to the issue particularly. Know this: God calls you to react boldly. To react, to respond boldly. And boldly includes involving yourself in a very particular way. But finally, not only involving yourself to impact the culture that you find around you, but in the same way to do the last part of this greater place of honor. It's the yielding of a greater honor. In Esther chapter 6 and verse 4, the king says, who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court in the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. And his attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. And when he entered, the king asked, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? I mean, I am amazing. So he answered the king, for the man that king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, and one of the royal crests, and place it on his head, and then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them robe the man in the king's delight, and lead him on the horse through the city, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights in. Well, the way the story goes, you remember Mordecai wanted this guy to be killed, to be hung up, to be impaled. Haman, thank you. Then, that's really good, because I wonder sometimes, So Haman wanted Mordecai to be killed, right? And so he had this big plan in place, but without any knowledge at all of that all going on, the king ended up asking him to actually be the guy to lead the guy he was going to kill, Mordecai, to lead him through the city honored. Now, you're going to hear the rest of the story next week, but here's what I want you to see. That if I were Mordecai, I got to know I'm in big trouble, because it wasn't just one time someone had said something to him about bowing the knee to Haman. It wasn't just one time. And things were brewing, and everybody knew. And you got to remember, everybody was in sackcloth and ashes. They were mourning the fact they were about to be killed. So if I were them, this is what I'd be saying. I'm confused. I'm lost. I'm unclear. I'm perplexed. Lord, I'm bewildered. I'm disoriented. And here's what I want you to remember. When I get to that place and I recognize that God says He's going to do all this stuff, He's going to take me to this place, this is what I want you to remember, that God permits what He could prevent. In the middle of this whole situation, Mordecai expecting that he was going to be killed, and Esther hoping she can do something to influence this, all of them are walking around a bit on pins and needles. And they get to this place, and I've got to tell you, maybe they wouldn't have been, but I would have been. Because you remember, there had been a great silence, and they weren't really sure where they were in their relationship with God. But God orchestrated events that none of them knew that were going on because of insomnia. That guy had insomnia, and Randy talked about that last week, about where they would read the Chronicles to him. And, excuse me, but because God used insomnia, and a guy who was a complete pagan, who was completely anti-God, God orchestrated an event that God not only saved the Jews, but He honored this man, Mordecai, to the place that the one that was trying to kill him ended up not honored. And I'll let somebody else tell you about that. Well, let's wind this down a bit, and let me talk to you then finally about some very real issues. Excuse me. And understand that as God is in control and He's doing what He needs to be done, there are times when I'm going to find myself doubting. And what has to happen is I have to yield to the circumstances that I don't even see happening, trusting that the God of the universe is involved in my life. Now, you might ask, what happens when I yield to the God of the universe who's permitting things in my life that could be prevented? Well, first of all, in the middle of my complaining, there are several things that can happen. One, you can be like me. You can find out in the middle of all this that God needed to teach you something that you didn't realize He needed to teach you. When I found myself taking care of people and bodily fluids and having everybody dump all their trash on me and take advantage of me, there's something I discovered. That God took me to a place that I hadn't expected to go. As a matter of fact, it was a place that I'd never gotten to go in ministry up to that point, because now I'm out of ministry, located ministry, being paid for ministry. And what I realized in the middle of all that being taken advantage of and all that ridicule is that God was trying to show me something. I'm not all that. That He doesn't need my ability to speak. He doesn't need my ability to cajole. He doesn't need my great knowledge. He doesn't need my education by way of psychology. But in the middle of the things that are happening to me, and a couple of things that were happening to me at that time was, every single day of my life, I had people come along, and all the things they didn't want to do, they dumped on me. Would you like that? And every single day of my life, at least when I was at work, I would have someone come up to me and tell me I was an idiot for not sleeping around with other women. And it went on and on and on. And what I realized was this, is that God, in the middle of all that, as I somehow decided to yield to Him, God did something to show me that He didn't need any of what I had to put me in the place of greater honor where I could pour into people's lives and save them away from this place where they're destroying their own life. One lady came to me during that time, and after almost 2 years, and she said this, and she'd been my greatest abuser. She says, you know I've dumped on you the whole time you've been here. I don't even really like you, or at least I didn't. And she said, do you know that thing I've been telling you about that you ought to sleep with other women? You know those 4 women that came and asked you if they'd sleep with you? If you would sleep with them? She said, I sent them as a joke. Now here's the interesting, I looked at her and I asked, well, why are you even telling me this now? She said, how are you still standing? Because I'm not that impressed with you. Well, thank you. I'm feeling a whole lot better. She said, I'm not that impressed with you, but somehow you're still standing, and there's something that's coming from you that's full of kindness and compassion. And then she began to tell me this tale of her life where she spent her whole life trying to take advantage of people to get one up. And she said, I've destroyed every friend I have. And she says, do you know you're the only person that will talk to me now? See, I didn't realize it, but I've been taken to a great place of honor. So as I recognize this place that I find myself in, God is orchestrating issues. And if I'd have known at the beginning, one person would have said, I have completely screwed up my life, and I want to know what other way there is, because obviously you have found it. So my call to you this morning as we close is this, is to recognize God might be teaching you that you're full of it. It might be that God's got you on display in other people so they can see what the real living Christ in you can do when you get hammered. And it may very well be that there are people who are in your life that God is calling you to, that you don't even realize God is orchestrating the events. But He's called you to a great place of honor to be God's man and God's woman, to get them to wake up to the fact that the way they're doing life is destroying themselves and everyone else around them. And Christ has another way. But the greater place of honor comes with a great cost. The question today would be this: who of you are willing to be in the greater place of honor? Because there'll be no fanfare. There'll be not a lot of people patting you on the back. As a matter of fact, it may go by silently, but you in the place of honor will have a dramatic impact to save person after person after person from the destruction in this life and in the one to come. Can we pray? Jesus, we love you and we're grateful. We're grateful for your life in us. And this is what we pray. We get really, really discouraged. We get discouraged by the fact that it's just overwhelming to operate in this place of honor. Lord, would you stir us up to recognize our place of influence? Would you cushion us? Would you at least remind us that it comes at a great cost? But with the great cost, to see the privilege of a person's life changed around, and a world that is hushed because of the reality that we have been willing to stand up and speak up, radically begins to transform our world in a quiet way that cannot be stopped. In Jesus' name, Lord, guide us. Amen.